Okay, so now I'm going to introduce to you the else if statement. So this is going to possibly test two conditions. So the second one will only test, the second test will only run if the first condition fails. Okay, and I'm also going to explain the difference between else if, nested ifs, and two if statements, because they all seem kind of similar, but there are subtle differences between all three types. Alright, so now we're going to take a look at the else if statement. So this is kind of an extension of the if statement where we can test two conditions, and we're not going to be testing them simultaneously. It's not quite like a nested if statement that we saw before. I'll show you a little bit more about it. So this is going to be else if statements where the second condition is only tested if the first passes, okay? Or rather, if the first fails, actually. So that's a big difference between that and the nested if statements that we saw. In the nested if statements, the first statement had to pass, then the second had to pass in order to execute the code. In this example, the second test only runs if the first test fails, okay? And that's why it's an else if. So we're going to use the example of a bank account to demonstrate this. First, I'm going to show you what it looks like. So we have an if statement, some kind of condition, and then we have the code to execute, and then we have an else if, and then condition 2. I'm just going to say condition 1 here. Else if condition 2, and then we have the code to execute. Okay? So this is kind of what it's going to look like. We'll first test the first condition. If this passes, we'll execute this code and exit. If this fails, then we'll skip over this code and we'll try this condition. If this passes, again, execute this code and exit. If this fails, we'll just exit. Okay? So again, coming back to this example of a bank account, let's say we have a certain amount of money in our account. So we're going to call this bank balance, and this is going to be variable because this can change depending on deposits or withdrawals. I know we should, in fact, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and use a double. Remember, these types should be capitalized, and that's why it was kind of giving me an issue when I had the lowercase d. Okay, so we're going to have a double, and let's set this equal to, let's say we only have $200 in our account right now. Okay, and so we have the bank balance, and now let's say we're trying to make some kind of a purchase. So let's call this purchase. In fact, I'm going to make this a constant because it's going to have a fixed price. And you know, you could make a purchase variable or constant because perhaps it would go on sale, in which case the price would change, and that would be better as a variable. But in this case, it doesn't really matter that much. Just be wary of when you're using constants and variables. Again, if you think the value might change, just use a variable. Okay, so purchase, this is also going to be double, and let's just set this to $50, and in fact, let's set this to $49.99 for now. Okay, that looks like a pretty standard store price. Okay, so the condition we want to test is whether or not we can make this purchase. So we'll only be able to make the purchase if we have enough money in our account, so we know we're going to need to compare the two. If we do have enough money in our account, let's have some kind of a message that says we can make the purchase, and if we don't have enough money, then we'll have another message saying you can't make the purchase. And speaking of that, I'm going to create another variable. It's going to be message, and this is going to be a type string, and I'm going to use an optional variable this time because I don't know that it has a value. It doesn't have a value yet, okay? And it might never have a value. Okay? So if you're unsure of the optional variable, I urge you to go back and watch that little section, but basically we use this question mark to denote an optional variable, and this just means that the variable doesn't yet have a value and we don't know if it will have a value. Okay? I don't want to initialize this to be an empty string because that is a value. Although it's empty, it has a specific value, whereas an optional has no value. Okay, so the first step will be to set up our if statement, and the first condition this keeps popping up, is going to be if purchase is greater than bank balance, then we can have some kind of a message saying you cannot make that purchase. You cannot buy that. How about that? Or rather, let's have something like not enough money. Okay? And then the else if purchase is, let's have if bank balance is greater than purchase, then we can have message saying something like plenty of money. In fact, let's say, yeah, plenty of money, spend away. Okay, so let's go over what is happening exactly here. So we're basically first testing to see if the purchase is greater than the bank balance. So in this case, we wouldn't have enough. We would have a much more expensive purchase. This could be like $300 or something. Maybe we only have like $20 in our account. So if that's the case, if this passes, so the purchase is greater than bank balance, we'll have this message saying we don't have enough money. And that's appropriate because you can't buy something that you don't have enough money to buy, unless you have a credit card, and that's a whole different story. And so, yeah, so this code executes if this test passes. However, if this fails, then instead of just exiting, we're going to try this second test. And in this case, we're going to test to see if our bank balance is greater than the purchase. And in this case, we just want to have some kind of a message that says, yeah, you have enough money, you can buy that. Okay, and this makes sense because in this case we'd have more money in our account than the purchase costs. So this test, keep in mind, this test that is the else if, will only run if the first test fails. So if this test passes, if the purchase is indeed greater than the bank balance, we don't even get this test running. And that's the difference between having two if statements, one after the other, and the else if statement. If we have two if statements, so something like this, if something, and then if something else, then both tests will run every single time. So we'll run this test regardless of the results of this, we'll run the second test. In this case, we will only run the second test if the first test fails. Okay, so if this passes, we exit, and the code, or rather the compiler, ignores this code. Okay, and because it's kind of cut off, let's go ahead and print out message and see what the results are. Okay, and still can't really see it. It says plenty of money, spend away, and that's exactly what we would expect because our bank balance is far greater than the purchase. However, what if this was only $20? Then we get the message, not enough money, and that's exactly right because in this case we ran this test and it passed, so the purchase was greater than the bank balance, so we get that message and we exit the loop, or rather we exit the if statement. Okay, so that's how else if statements work. Just to give you a brief summary, we use the example of a bank account. We were trying to see if we could make a purchase. We'd only be able to do that if we had a greater balance than the purchase. So we want to run this test, and there are going to be two conditions. Well, technically three, and that's if the bank balance equals a purchase, but we don't really care about that. So the first test is going to see if the bank balance is less than the purchase. We're going to have a message print out. If the bank balance is greater than the purchase, we'll have a different message print out, and the else if test only runs if the if test fails. Okay? So that's else if statements for you. The next part of our tutorial will be focusing on else statements, which will be the second last type that we'll see. Okay, so in this part of the tutorial I introduced the else if statement to you. So I also showed you the differences between the types of if statements we've seen so far. So these have been else if statements, we've looked at nested ifs and double ifs. Now double if statements only really run, or both tests will run regardless of the outcome of either one of the two. Nested ifs, only basically the first one will run, and the second one within the if statement will only run if the first if statement passes. But in this case, with the else if statement, the second test only runs if the first test fails. Okay, so we could possibly only run one test or two. So we use the example of trying to make a purchase to demonstrate this, where basically we had a bank balance and then we had a purchase we were trying to make. So we first tested to see if we couldn't make the purchase, and if that test failed, which means we had enough money, we tested to make sure we did, and then we had messages print out basically based on the outcomes of those tests. Okay, so next we'll be looking at else statements. So now I'm going to introduce to you the else statement, which is going to be one of the last types of if statements we'll look at. So this is just a way to encompass all other possible outcomes without running another test. Okay, I'll explain more about what I mean in just a minute here. And I'm also going to show you the difference between else and else if statements. Okay, so the difference is subtle in that else if runs a test, whereas else doesn't. Okay, but we're going to get more into that in just a minute. Alright, so now we're going to look at one more type of if statement, and that's just going to be the else statement. Okay, so this is basically a type of statement that encompasses all other possible outcomes without running a test. So far we've seen kind of all if statements, else if statements, nested if statements. They all test some kind of a condition and then have an outcome based on that test. Well, else statements run no test, they just give an outcome. So it's basically if all else fails, then do this. So else statements encompass all other possible outcomes without running a test. Okay, so for this, to demonstrate how an else statement works, I'm going to use the example of kind of like a fruit basket where we have a bunch of different fruits and we're only really interested in one of them, and if we get any of the others we're gonna be unhappy. Okay, so what kind of fruits could we have? I'm just going to put these in a comment. Well, we could have apples, we could have bananas, we could have oranges, pears, and maybe peaches or something. Okay, so these are some possible fruits, and oranges are the ones we want. So I'm going to create this constant. I'm going to say something like, I'm going to call it fruit I like, and I'm going to call this, let's go with oranges, and let's give this a type string, and we're going to go with orange. Okay, so we just have this constant, it's called fruit I like, it's a string, and it's orange. So we're basically going to test to see if a fruit we pick is going to be equal to the fruit we like. So let's create a variable here, and this is going to be fruit picked. It's going to be of type string, and for now let's give this the value of apple. So this is something that we don't like. Okay, so now we'll set up the if statement. So we want to test to see if fruit I like, and that's going to be the first option there, is equal to the fruit picked. That's the second option. And if it is, then we're going to have maybe some kind of a message, which I should create now. Message string, and I'm just going to leave it as optional up here because we don't know what value it will contain yet. Now we're going to set message equal to, let's have it say something like, yum, I like that fruit. And if it's not, else, we're going to have the message be something like, yuck, I hate that. Even though I don't, to be honest, I kind of like all of these fruits, but, you know, just keeping in line with this example. So basically what we're going to say is we're going to test to see if the fruit that we picked is the same as the one that we like. If it is, then we change the value of message and we exit the if statement. And if it's not, if it's any of these other four, so apples, bananas, pears, or peaches, then we're going to have this message that we hate that. Okay? So again, this if or this else statement isn't actually running a test. It's just saying if it's anything else, all other possibilities, any of the other four fruits, then we're going to execute this code here, which in this case is changing the value of message to yuck, I hate that. Okay, so the reason that we use these else statements is if we want to have the same outcome based on all other possibilities. Okay, so in this case, we're only interested in one of the outcomes, and that's if the fruit picked is the same as the fruit we like, and if it's not, if it's any of the other fruits, then we're going to produce a different message, and it's going to be the same for each one. If we wanted a different message for each of these four fruits, then we'd have to create 4 different else if statements. In this case, we just want one particular outcome for all other 4 possibilities. Okay, so that's why the else statement is useful. It's basically, if this doesn't happen, then we're just going to do this for all other cases. Okay, and message, I think it displays it there, but we're just going to display it again here, is going to be yuck, I hate that. Okay, and that's because the fruit I like is not the same as a fruit picked. So we're going to get the same message regardless of which fruit it is, unless it's orange. So if we try with banana, we get the same outcome. If we try with pear, again, same outcome. The only time we'd get a different outcome is if it's orange, and then we say, yum, I like that fruit. That's excellent. So again, this else statement will only run first if the first test fails, and it will always produce the same outcome regardless of all other possibilities. Okay, so that's an else statement for you. We will just do a brief summary. The difference between the else if statement is that the else if has a test, and if that fails, then nothing happens, whereas the else has no test and it produces this outcome regardless of any other tests. Okay, so regardless of what happens, this will be the outcome unless this test passes. Okay, so the else statement just kind of gives I guess it gives kind of like an outcome that will always happen if the first test passes, whereas if this was an else if, then we would only get an outcome if that second test passed. Okay, so that's the big difference between the two. I will show you another example, and then maybe we'll look at a quick example of all of them combined together. Alright, so in this part of our tutorial, we introduce to you the else statement. So this is a statement that allows code to run regardless of all other outcomes. So we'll first have the initial test, and if that fails, in this particular instance, we saw that we'll have some kind of outcome regardless of all other possibilities. So we're only interested in producing a message for the first test, if that passed, and then if the first test failed, then there were a few other options that could execute, but we don't really care about the difference between those. We just wanted some kind of generic message after that. Okay, so that's where else statements come in handy, is they're really good for if there's many possible outcomes, or rather, yeah, there's many different possibilities, but we're only interested in one of them, and the others we can kind of do the same thing for all of those. So we use the example of picking fruit when we only liked one type, so we had 5 different types of fruit, and we only like one of them, and if the one that we picked wasn't the one that we liked, regardless of which of the 4 it was, then we had the same message saying that we didn't like it. Okay, so else statements, great for basically just encompassing all other possibilities, and if you want some kind of generic thing to happen regardless of which of the test cases it is.